Thank you. I'm going to talk about cats and computers, but before that, let's dive right in with a small pop quiz. I'd like to ask you to raise your hand as soon as we identify what's in the following series of photos. So the first one. Okay, pretty easy, a dog and a duck. Let's do another one. Very intelligent crowd. Horse and a goat. One last one. Okay. I guess all of you understood that these are a rabbit and a cat. But how can you tell that these are a rabbit and a cat? If I ask you how you know that these are a rabbit and a cat, I mean, they both have kind of the same fur. Their ears are approximately of the same size. They both have whiskers. I mean, if you were to teach a small child, a toddler, what a cat and a rabbit are, how would you explain it to them? I bet you wouldn't mention any of these specific features. You just show them examples and let them figure it out. And this paradigm is used to solve all sorts of tasks in computer science, and this is what's known as machine learning. So machine learning always starts with a question. It can be, is this a cat? And how we solve this question is by collecting examples of pictures of cats and pictures that aren't cats, and making some sort of computation that's supposed to make sense out of those examples. And then, based on that, we can predict and answer new questions. And the question is essentially interchangeable as long as you have the data for it, as long as you have examples. It can be, is this a cat? Is this a rabbit? Or maybe, is this a pedestrian? As long as you have examples, you can solve the question. And this unified approach for problem solving led to quite amazing advancements throughout science and technology throughout the last couple of years. It allows people to build autonomous cars, to predict protein structures, to build chess engines which are better in chess than any human being will ever be, to design chatbots, which became very popular throughout the last couple of months, and most importantly for this talk, allows people to identify cats quite reliably. But from a scientific perspective, there are two natural questions this paradigm raises. How many examples do we need, and how much computation do we need? I mean, it's clear that these questions become especially important once you start considering maybe less silly questions, like, is this tumor benign? Or is a drug safe? Or is crossing a junction safe? Or in the context of chatbots, trying to understand whether a sentence is offensive. You need to understand how many examples you need to do and how much computation do you need to spend. So there's a statistical aspect and a computational aspect. And quite amazingly, both are completely outside of the scope of current knowledge. How people always deal with these issues, the common practice is how many examples do they need, as much as they can put their hands on, and how much computation will they do, as much as they can afford. So here's how it typically goes. Let's say a group of researchers wants to identify cats, to build an algorithm that identifies cats automatically. So they'll collect a bunch of photos of cats, run this massive computation, typically on a server across the sea, and then they get this machine learning model, this algorithm that predicts whether stuff are cats or not. So they want to validate it. So they'll feed it a bunch of cats, and it indeed identifies them as cats, and maybe they'll also try it with things that aren't cats, and indeed see that they aren't cats, as predicted correctly by the machine learning model. And every once in a while, they'll probably get this maybe example, which the machine learning model doesn't exactly know how to make sense out of. And maybe it'll even get it wrong. And maybe it'll make so many mistakes so that they're not impressed by the machine learning model, and they want to fix it. But they're not really sure in practice why it made those mistakes. So what they'll always do is just collect a bunch of new cats, feed them into the new model, and get a better model, and now it predicts well even those harder examples, and voila. It seems good enough, so they're happy. But obviously, this is a huge waste of time and energy. If they would know how much examples they needed in the first place and how to utilize more efficient computation, they didn't need to do this whole trial and error process. And it's even more so, for some applications, you can't afford doing a trial and error process. Consider, for example, designing a drug. You can't just eventually find out that the drug's not safe and just do it all over again. People may die in the process. And if you don't know whether your answer is reliable or not, you're just not going to take the risk in the first place. So current machine learning algorithm and the methodology that people use suffers inherently from inefficiency and unreliability. And what machine learning theory, the field in which I work at, aims is to solve these problems. So the question we always have in mind, the motivating question, is giving some task, how many examples do we need in order to come up with a reliable answer for that task? So in order to understand this question, let's start from understanding how even a single example looks from the point of view of a computer. So let's go back to that cube picture from before. This specific picture has 360 pixels over 550. That means that this picture alone already consists of nearly 200,000 pixels. And each pixel is represented typically on a computer by 3 channels, like it's red channel, green, and blue values. That means that this one picture already consists of more than 500,000 pieces of little information. So if we want to go over several examples, we already need to go over millions of variables. When people say big data, which is a term that comes up a lot in modern computer science, this is exactly what they mean. They mean that each example that they're considering includes many variables, for example, many pixels or many bits of information, maybe a huge sequence of DNA, and also that there are many examples to make sense out of. And it kind of makes sense, and it's very intuitive, that more variables means that it's more complicated, that the computation is heavier. And this is indeed true throughout mathematics and computational mathematics. There's a theme called the curse of dimensionality, that things that have more variables, based on more variables, are harder to learn and require more difficult computation. But actually, there's more to that. There's more than meets the eye, or exactly what meets the eye. When we look at a natural image, for example, we identify a lot of redundancy. For example, fur kind of always looks the same. And probably if we would go and look at their corresponding pixels, we'd see a lot of similarities. And we could reduce these redundancies. And also, natural images and natural data has a lot of symmetries. For example, if I were to take this picture and flip it, the pixels got completely disoriented, but we know that these represent the same picture. So it's all about the structure and symmetry, and this is where the math kicks in. Because if we identify efficiently these structures and symmetries, this could lead to much more efficient algorithms. So in my research, I want to show that although it may seem that more variables can lead to more complicated situations, it also is true that more variables mean that there's more structure to utilize. In particular, I focus a lot on the interplay between the dimension of different learning tasks and how complicated they are to learn in terms of the statistical complexity and the computational complexity. That means that we, in our research, both aim to design efficient algorithms, which provably show that a certain number of examples suffices in order to learn, but also revealing fundamental barriers. That is, showing that you can't do enough you can't do good learning unless you see so-and-so number of examples. While it may seem by talking about computers and computation that my research is about code and computers, it's actually not so. This is like a small excerpt of a paper of mine. It's all about the math. It's all about understanding the inner workings about how these fundamental learning tasks behave and how we can utilize their structures in order to get more efficient learning algorithms. In particular, I've been interested in a recent line of work that I've been involved in that shows that in certain scenarios, high-dimensional problems that include many variables can actually lead to provable benefits to better and more efficient learning. And in particular, there's this kind of emerging understanding that us theoreticians are starting to make sense out of, that it may be the case that in natural data, we don't really have a curse of dimensionality, but rather a bliss of dimensionality. We can use that structure even in a way that compensates for the fact that it includes more variables. So to conclude in looking into the future, I think it's clear that we need to understand how machine learning algorithms work in order to be able to optimize and trust them and use them reliably. This is especially important since for some applications, we will just never have a lot of data. Think, for example, about trying to design a drug for a rare disease where you only have several examples of people with that disease. While it may seem like a fantasy, I personally believe that it's possible in principle. I mean, we know that a child doesn't need to see many examples of cats in order to identify one. So why should our algorithms? Thanks.